The night had settled over Baker Street without ceremony. There was no wind strong enough to stir the curtains, no carriage passing close enough to disturb the pavement. The street existed in a paused state, as though it were holding its breath. Inside 221B, the air was warm and unhurried. A small fire burned in the grate. It did not crackle. It did not flare. It maintained a steady, predictable glow, casting a soft amber light that rested on the furniture and went no further. Shadows remained where they belonged, neither advancing nor retreating. Sherlock Holmes sat in his chair near the hearth. His posture was upright, but unstrained. His hands rested loosely, fingertips touching, without movement. His eyes were open, yet unfocused, directed toward nothing in particular. He was not thinking in the way most men think. He was allowing the room to remain exactly as it was. Across the room, Dr. Watson sat at the small writing table. A notebook lay open before him. The pen remained still in his hand. He had written nothing for several minutes. Experience had taught him that silence, when Holmes permitted it, should not be interrupted. The clock on the mantel marked the passing of time with a soft, regular sound. Each second followed the last with perfect discipline. Watson noticed it only because nothing else demanded attention. At length, Holmes moved. It was not a sudden motion. It was not a decision made quickly. He leaned forward just enough to reach the small stack of correspondence arranged neatly at the corner of the table beside him. His fingers selected the top envelope. The paper was thick, slightly textured, uncreased. Holmes held it up to the light without opening it. He examined the edges, the seal, the angle at which the address had been written. His face showed no expression beyond mild acknowledgement. Watson remained still. The envelope was addressed in a firm, deliberate hand. The ink had dried evenly. There was no hesitation in the lettering, no flourish intended to impress. Holmes turned it once, then again, as though weighing not the letter itself, but the intention behind it. Only then did he break the seal. The sound of tearing paper was soft, controlled. Holmes removed the contents carefully and unfolded the single sheet inside. He did not read it immediately. Instead, he smoothed the paper flat against the table with the side of his hand, ensuring it lay perfectly still. Watson watched the fire. When Holmes finally read, his eyes moved slowly, not line by line, but section by section. He absorbed the message in silence. No muscle in his face tightened. No breath changed its rhythm. After a moment, Holmes folded the paper once and set it down. Watson waited. "It is warning," Holmes said at last, his voice low and even. Of a sort, Watson did not ask from whom. Holmes rose and crossed the room to the window. He parted the curtain slightly and looked down at the empty street. The gas lamps glowed at regular intervals, each pool of light contained and self-sufficient. "There are places," Holmes continued, "where fear is not loud. It does not announce itself. It settles. It becomes part of the routine." Watson closed his notebook without sound. Holmes returned to his chair. He sat again, resuming the same posture as before, as though he had never moved. "The letter," he said, "contains a name, a location, and an implication." Watson nodded once. "The name is Douglas," Holmes went on. "The location is Burlstone, a house surrounded by water." Watson made no comment. "The implication," Holmes said, "is that the past has arrived quietly." Holmes reached for the letter once more and passed it across the table. Watson accepted it and read. The message was brief. Its meaning, however, lingered. Watson folded the paper and returned it. "The house," Watson said, "is already known?" The fire shifted slightly, sending a brief change of light across the ceiling. It settled again almost immediately. "There is no urgency," Holmes added. "That is the unusual part." Watson considered this. "In cases where violence has occurred, Holmes continued. There is typically haste, confusion, raised voices. This is not such a case. He reached for his violin, resting nearby. He did not play. He adjusted the instrument's position on the table, aligning it parallel to the edge, and then let his hand fall away. The scene, Holmes said, has already cooled. Watson allowed his breathing to slow. Holmes closed his eyes briefly, then opened them again. A man is dead, he said, in a room that was locked. The details have been preserved with care, almost too much care. Watson felt the familiar shift that accompanied the beginning of a case. Yet there was none of the tension he had come to expect. Instead, the room remained calm, as though the matter were distant, already past. We will go, Holmes said, but not tonight. Watson looked at the clock. The morning will suffice, Holmes continued. The facts will not change. He stood and extinguished one of the lamps, reducing the light further. The room responded by growing softer, quieter. Watson rose and moved toward the bedroom door, then paused. Holmes, he said. Yes, this letter. It carries more weight than it emits. Holmes inclined his head slightly. It does, he agreed. Weight does not always require force. Watson nodded and left the room. Holmes remained seated. He watched the fire as it diminished, ember by ember. Outside, Baker Street continued its silence, unaware of Burlstone, unaware of the valley that lay far beyond England, where fear had once been organized, measured, and made routine. Holmes allowed the quiet to return fully before closing his eyes. The case had begun, not with urgency, not with alarm, but with a letter that arrived on time, and a room that remained still. Morning arrived at Baker Street gradually. It did not announce itself with noise or movement. It entered the rooms by degrees, thinning the darkness at the edges, softening the corner where night had settled. The street outside remained quiet, its early sounds distant and unassertive. Holmes was already awake. He sat at the small table near the window, the letter from the previous night, laid open once more before him. Daylight revealed nothing new in the paper itself. The ink remained steady. The creases lay where he had smoothed them. Holmes read again, not to learn, but to confirm. Across the room, Watson stirred and rose from his chair. He moved carefully, as though unwilling to disturb the atmosphere that had carried over from the night. He washed, dressed, and returned without speaking. The kettle warmed slowly on the stove. Holmes folded the letter and placed it into his pocket. He then selected a newspaper from the stack on the sideboard and unfolded it to the middle pages. His eyes passed over columns of print without pause. Nothing there required attention. Watson poured the tea. They drank in silence. After a time, Holmes stood and retrieved a small leather case from the shelf. He opened it and checked its contents with methodical care. Each item was returned to its place, not because it was needed, but because order was expected. We will leave shortly, Holmes said. Watson nodded. There was no rush to gather belongings. Coats were taken from hooks. Gloves were selected without deliberation. Holmes checked the lock on a door twice, not out of concern, but out of habit. Outside, the air was cool and still. The street appeared unchanged from the night before. A milk cart passed at the far end, its sound reduced to a suggestion. They walked without speaking. At the station, Holmes purchased tickets with exact change. The clerk asked no questions. The exchange concluded without remark. The train waited. Inside the carriage, the seats were clean and firm. Holmes selected one by the window. Watson sat opposite him. The carriage filled slowly, though no one chose to sit close enough to intrude. As the train began to move, Holmes rested his head lightly against the back of the seat and closed his eyes. Watson watched the city thin and dissolve into open space. The rhythm of the tracks settled into a steady pattern. It was neither fast nor slow. It required no attention to follow. Holmes spoke without opening his eyes. "The house," he said, "stands apart from its surroundings." Watson waited. "It is bordered by water," Holmes continued, "not as a defense, but as a habit. The moat remains, not because it is needed, but because it has always been there." Watson pictured it without effort. "The room," Holmes said, "was secured from within, the door fastened. The windows closed, the occupants accounted for." Watson shifted slightly as the train took a gentle curve. "The absence," Holmes added, "is more informative, and the presence." He opened his eyes and looked out the window. Watson did not ask what was absent. The countryside passed with uniform calm. Fields, hedges, distant trees, each element appeared briefly, and then withdrew, replaced by the next. Time moved without resistance. Holmes removed a small notebook from his coat pocket and made a single notation. The pencil moved once, then stopped. Watson felt the familiar stillness return. The case was present, but not pressing. It existed alongside the movement of the train, not above it. At a small station, the train slowed. A handful of passengers disembarked. The doors closed again. Holmes watched them step away without interest. "Fear," he said quietly, "often disguises itself as structure." Watson listened. "When fear becomes organized," Holmes continued, "it adopts rules, codes, rituals. These remain long after the danger has passed." The train resumed its pace. Watson's thoughts drifted, unanchored. The sound of the wheels became background, steady and dependable. They arrived in the early afternoon. The station was modest, the platform clean. A constable waited at a distance, his presence more procedural than urgent. Holmes acknowledged him with a nod. The walk to the carriage was brief. The driver said little. Holmes gave an address. The horse started forward at an unhurried pace. The road curved gently through open land. The sky remained pale and even. There were no dramatic changes in light. At last, the house appeared. It stood low and solid, its stone walls undisturbed by time. Water surrounding it lay flat, reflecting the sky without distortion. Nothing moved on its surface. Holmes stepped down first. He stood still for a moment, observing. "The water," he said, "has not been disturbed recently." Watson followed his gaze. The moat remained smooth. They crossed the narrow bridge and approached the door. The house did not resist their arrival. It accepted it. Inside, the air was cool and unchanged. The rooms were orderly. Nothing appeared hurried. Nothing appeared concealed. Holmes removed his gloves and placed them on the side table. He did not yet move further. "This," he said, "is a place where events have already concluded." Watson felt the truth of it settle. Man waited to receive them. His manner was calm, his words measured. He explained without embellishment. Holmes listened without interruption. When the explanation ended, Holmes nodded once. "We will see the room," he said. They followed. The corridor was narrow, the walls close. The door at the end remained shut. Holmes paused before it. He did not touch the handle immediately. Instead, he listened. There was nothing to hear. Only then did he open the door. The room beyond lay exactly as described, still, preserved, waiting. Holmes stepped inside. Watson remained at the threshold, allowing the silence to settle first. The second phase of the case had begun, not with discovery, but with confirmation. The room accepted Holmes without resistance. It was neither large nor small. Its proportions were balanced, its corners softened by time rather than wear. Daylight entered through the window in a thin, patient line, touching the floor and stopping there. As though it had been instructed not to proceed further, Holmes stood just inside the doorway. He did not cross the threshold immediately. His eyes moved slowly, taking in the entire space at once. Nothing in the room called for haste. Watson remained a step behind, his presence contained, careful not to disturb the arrangement that had been preserved so deliberately. The bed stood against the far wall, neatly made, its cover smooth flat. A small table rested beside it, holding a book closed at its center, a lamp burned down, and nothing more. The chair near the window had been pushed back slightly, as though its occupant had risen without urgency. Holmes moved at last. He crossed to the center of the room and stopped again. His gaze lowered, following the lines in the floorboards. They ran true and uninterrupted. There were no scuffs, no signs of struggle, no indication that the room had resisted what had occurred within it. The absence of disorder, Holmes said quietly, is consistent. Watson nodded once. Holmes turned toward the door. He examined the lock without touching it, noting its position, the angle of the bolt, the clean edge where metal met wood. It remained engaged. "This door," Holmes said, "has not been forced." Watson did not approach. He watched from where he stood. Holmes moved next to the window. The glass was clear, the latch secure. He tested it gently, allowing it to move no more than a fraction. It settled back into place without sound. The room, Holmes continued, was closed deliberately, not hurriedly. He straightened and allowed his attention to widen again, taking in the space as a whole. Watson's eyes followed the same path. The room offered no overt answer. It held itself together, neutral and unremarkable. Holmes crouched slowly near the hearth. The ashes lay undisturbed. The grate held no recent heat. A fire was not used, he said. There was no need for it. He rose and returned to the center of the room. Watson stepped inside at last, placing his foot carefully where the floorboards appeared most worn. He felt the cool stillness settle around him. The body lay near the wall. It was positioned without violence. There was no suggestion of struggle in the limbs. The man's face was turned slightly to one side, his expression neutral, almost thoughtful. Time had already softened the details. Holmes did not look at the face immediately. Instead, he observed the distance between the body and the furniture, the alignment of the limbs with the room itself. The placement, Holmes said, is intentional. Watson remained still. Holmes knelt and examined the clothing. He noted the cut, the fit, the absence of damage. The fabric lays but of half after an unremarkable movement. There is no sign, Holmes said, of haste. He rose again, allowing the body to return to the edge of his awareness rather than its center. Watson felt no discomfort. The room had already absorbed what had occurred. It no longer demanded attention. Holmes walked slowly along the walls, his fingertips hovering just above the surface, never quite touching. He stopped beneath the window. "There," he said. Watson followed his gaze. A faint mark rested low on the wall, barely visible unless one knew to look for it. It suggested contact, not impact. Holmes studied it without comment. "The mark," he said at last, "does not belong to the event itself. It belongs to what followed." Watson considered this. Holmes returned to the door and stood facing it. He opened and closed it once, slowly, observing the sound, the movement, the resistance. "The lock," he said, "was engaged from within, but the room does not behave as though it were sealed." Watson looked around again. The room seemed open despite its closures. Holmes removed a small measuring tape from his pocket and extended it with care. He measured the distance between the door and the body, between the body and the window, between the window and the hearth. Each measurement was noted and then forgotten. "The room," Holmes said, "is telling us what it is not." Watson waited. "It is not a place of confusion. It is not a place of interruption. And it is not a place where the unexpected occurred." Holmes stood once more at the center of the room. He closed his eyes briefly. Watson watched the dust in the light shift almost imperceptibly. "There are cases," Holmes said, "where the solution announces itself. This is not one of them." He opened his eyes. "This is a case," he continued, "where the room has been asked to lie." Watson felt the weight of the statement, though it carried no urgency. Holmes turned toward the doorway. "We will leave it as it is," he said, "for now." Watson stepped aside to allow him passage. They exited the room without altering anything. The door closed behind them with the same quiet certainty with which it had opened. In the corridor, the air felt unchanged. The house absorbed their movement and returned to stillness. Holmes paused once more, listening. "There is nothing more to hear here," he said. Watson nodded. They moved away from the room, carrying with them not a discovery, but a question that remained calm, patient, and unresolved. The house continued to stand, the water remained still, and the room returned to waiting. They moved away from the room without haste. The corridor accepted them quietly, its narrowness unchanged by their passing. The walls bore no ornament, no mark that demanded interpretation. The house did not guide, it did not resist, it simply remained. Holmes walked with measured steps, his pace even, his attention wide rather than fixed. Watson followed, noting how sound behaved in the space. Footsteps softened quickly. Voices, when spoken at all, seemed unnecessary. They entered a small sitting room that overlooked the water. The window here was broader, its panes clean, the sill bare. Outside, the moat reflected the pale afternoon sky with such precision that it appeared less like water and more like glass laid flat. Holmes stopped near the window and stood still. "The house," he said, "is consistent." Watson waited. "There are no contradictions," Holmes continued, "no areas of neglect, no attempts at concealment." Watson glanced around. The furniture was arranged sensibly. Chairs faced one another without implication. A small table held a stack of papers aligned neatly at the edge. Holmes approached the table and examined the papers without lifting them. His eyes traced the top page only, noting margins, spacing, and the pressure of the pen. "Routine," he said. "Maintained?" Watson moved closer to the window. The water remained unmoved. "There are houses," Holmes went on, "that respond to disturbance. This one does not." He turned and looked back toward the corridor. "It has already incorporated the event." Watson understood the meaning without fully articulating it. They continued through the lower rooms. Each space revealed the same quality of order. Nothing was misplaced. Nothing had been hurried. The house offered no emotional residue. In the kitchen, utensils were clean and dry. A loaf of bread sat covered, its crust unbroken. The air carried no scent beyond what was expected. Holmes paused at the threshold. "No interruption," he said. Watson nodded. They returned to the main hall, where a narrow staircase rose to the upper floor. Holmes placed his hand lightly on the banister, feeling the wood without gripping it. "Upstairs," he said, "you will find the same." They ascended slowly. The upper landing was quiet. Doors stood closed, each aligned evenly with the frame. Holmes opened one at random. A bedroom, unused, prepared, but empty. He closed it again and opened another. A study, small and orderly. Books lined by size, not subject. A desk cleared of anything unnecessary. Holmes did not enter. "It is not what is present," he said, "that concerns me." Watson remained beside him. It is what has been allowed to remain unchanged. They returned to the landing. Holmes stood for a moment, then turned back toward the stairs. "We will speak to the occupants," he said. They descended and were received in a modest drawing room. The light here was softer, filtered through curtains drawn just enough to reduce glare without excluding the day. Mrs. Douglas sat near the window. Her posture was composed. Her hands rested folded in her lap. She did not appear distressed, nor did she appear unaffected. Her manner suggested containment rather than suppression. Holmes greeted her politely and took a seat opposite. Watson positioned himself slightly to the side. Holmes spoke gently, his tone even. "You were present in the house," he said. She inclined her head. "And you heard nothing?" Holmes continued. "That is correct," she replied. Her voice carried no tremor. It did not strain for emphasis. "The door was locked," Holmes said. "Yes." "And the room remained undisturbed until morning?" "Yes." Holmes listened without interruption. Watson observed the space between statements. There were no gaps that required filling. Holmes asked no further questions. He rose and thanked her. The exchange concluded without wait. Outside the room, Holmes paused. "She is telling the truth," he said. Watson accepted this. "But," Holmes added, "it is not the entire truth." They stepped back into the hall. "The narrative," Holmes said, "has been simplified." Watson followed. They crossed the house once more and stepped outside. The bridge lay quiet beneath their feet. The water reflected them briefly and then returned to stillness. Holmes stopped at the edge of the moat and looked down. "The water," he said, "is part of the design." Watson joined him. "It separates without isolating," Holmes continued. "It slows approach. It encourages reflection." He straightened. This house was chosen. Watson considered the statement. They walked along the perimeter, Holmes occasionally stopping to examine the ground. He did not kneel. He did not touch. His observations were made from a distance. "There is no recent disturbance," he said. "No indication of hurried movement." Watson felt the day remain calm. They returned toward the entrance. "The solution," Holmes said, "will not be found here." Watson looked back once more at the house. "It will be found," Holmes continued, "in a place that is not present." They crossed the bridge again and prepared to depart. The house accepted their leaving as it had accepted their arrival. Behind them, the walls remained unchanged. The water lay flat. The rooms resumed their waiting. Holmes adjusted his coat. "The house has finished speaking," he said. Watson nodded, and with that, they turned away, carrying not evidence, but an absence that required patience rather than pursuit. The carriage moved away from the house without sound enough to linger. Its wheels followed the curve of the road, steady and unremarkable, until the stone walls and still water of Burlstone slipped from view. The landscape resumed its gentle rhythm, fields opening and closing at the edge of sight, hedges repeating themselves with patient regularity. Holmes sat back, his posture relaxed, his hands resting loosely together. His gaze was directed outward, but not fixed on any particular detail. Watson sat opposite, allowing the motion of the carriage to settle his thoughts. For a time, neither spoke. The driver maintained a constant pace. The horse responded without need for correction. The road offered no obstacles, no deviations that required attention. Holmes broke the silence. "When a place has been prepared," he said, "it often reveals less than a place taken by surprise." Watson listened. "The house," Holmes continued, "was not reacting. It was performing." Watson considered the word. "A performance," Holmes said, "does not require deception, only consistency." The carriage crossed a narrow bridge. Water passed beneath them, darker here, less reflective, moving just enough to be noticed. Watson watched it recede. The room, Holmes went on, was arranged to confirm a conclusion already anticipated. Watson shifted slightly. The conclusion, Holmes said, was not intended for us. They continued in silence. The village appeared ahead, modest and self-contained. The carriage slowed as it entered the narrow street. Holmes directed the driver to stop near the small inn opposite the station. They stepped down. The air here carried faint traces of smoke and earth. Doors were closed, curtains drawn. The day continued without reference to the events at the house beyond the water. Inside the inn, the room was plain and orderly. Holmes chose a table near the wall. Watson took the opposite chair. A pot of tea was brought without delay. Holmes poured carefully. "The police," he said, "will remain at the house." Watson nodded. "They will examine what is visible," Holmes continued. "They will record what aligns." Watson waited. "They will not question a structure," Holmes said, "only the details." The tea cooled gradually. "There is a second narrative," Holmes added. "It does not exist here." Watson took a slow sip. "It exists," Holmes said, "in repetition." Watson understood. Holmes reached into his coat and removed his notebook. He opened it and reviewed the single notation he had made earlier. He added nothing. "The name Douglas," Holmes said, "is not recent." Watson raised his eyes. "It has appeared before," Holmes continued, "in contexts that required removal rather than resolution." Watson said nothing. "The valley," Holmes said, "it is not geographic." He closed the notebook. "It is procedural." Outside, footsteps passed. A door opened and closed. The inn absorbed these sounds and released them again without emphasis. "We will wait," Holmes said. Watson accepted this. Time passed in small increments. The tea was finished. Another pot arrived. The light at the window shifted slightly, altering the tone of the room without changing its character. At length, a man entered and approached Holmes's table. His manner was respectful, his voice low. Holmes listened. He asked one question. It was answered. The man departed. Holmes remained still. "The name," he said, "is connected to an organization." Watson did not ask which. "It no longer exists," Holmes continued, "but its habits do." Watson leaned back slightly. "The house," Holmes said, "was chosen because it concludes a pattern." Watson waited. "The beginning," Holmes said, "lies elsewhere." Holmes stood. "We will return to London," he said, "tonight." Watson rose without comment. At the station, the train waited as before. The platform was quiet. Tickets were exchanged. The carriage received them with familiar neutrality. As the train moved, Holmes rested his head back and closed his eyes. Watson watched the landscape recede, its repetition steady, its details interchangeable. "The past," Holmes said softly, without opening his eyes, "does not always pursue loudly." Watson listened. "Sometimes," Holmes continued, "it waits until silence is sufficient." The train continued its measured course. London awaited them, unchanged. And far behind, beyond water and walls, the house remained complete, having served its purpose and nothing more. London received them without comment. The train slowed, then stopped, its motion resolving into stillness as naturally as it had begun. The platform was familiar in every detail. Porters moved with practiced economy. Voices remained low, indistinct, never rising long enough to form a memory. Holmes stepped down first. He paused only to orient himself, not because direction was uncertain, but because routine required acknowledgement. Watson followed, adjusting his coat against the cool evening air. The city was as it had been before they left. That, Watson noted, was its most consistent quality. They took a cab. The horse moved steadily, navigating streets that required no instruction. Lamps were lit at regular intervals. Windows glowed faintly, revealing interiors already settling into night. Holmes sat back, his attention diffuse. He did not speak. Watson allowed the motion of the cab to quiet the remnants of travel. The day had contained no urgency, no confrontation, no sudden turn. And yet, something had been set in motion, subtle but undeniable. They arrived at Baker Street. The familiar door opened. The stairs received them. Inside 2021B, the air retained its usual balance of warmth and stillness, as though it had been waiting without impatience. Holmes removed his coat and placed it carefully on the stand. His gloves followed. Watson set his hat aside and moved toward the fire, which had been prepared earlier and now required only minimal attention. Holmes crossed to the table and laid out several papers. They were not new. They had been waiting. He did not sit immediately. Instead, he stood, hands resting lightly on the back of the chair, eyes lowered toward the documents, without focusing on any single one. The house, he said at last, did not begin the case. Watson settled into his chair. It concluded a chapter, Holmes continued, one that had already been written elsewhere. Watson nodded. Holmes. He selected a paper and read a short passage, then set it aside. He took another. His movements were deliberate, unhurried, almost ceremonial. These, he said, indicating the small stack, are fragments. Watson waited. They reference a system, Holmes continued, one designed to persist through repetition rather than force. The fire shifted softly. Holmes leaned back and closed his eyes briefly, then reopened them. In such systems, he said, names are rarely unique. They are reassigned. Watson considered this. The name Douglas, Holmes went on, has functioned before as a designation rather than an identity. Watson felt the room settle further into quiet. Holmes reached for his violin and adjusted its position again, as he had done the night before. Once more, he did not play. The past, Holmes said, is often preserved not through memory, but through procedure. Watson watched the flame bend slightly as air moved through the room. There is a place, Holmes continued, where procedure was once elevated to governance. He paused. It is referred to, he said, as a valley. Watson did not ask for its location. It was isolated, Holmes went on, not by geography alone, but by agreement. Holmes folded his hands. Rules replaced judgment. Silence replaced dissent. Routine replaced uncertainty. Watson listened, his breathing slow. When such systems dissolve, Holmes said, they do not disappear, they disperse. He opened one of the papers again. Individuals leave, he said. Habits remain. The clock on the mantel marked the seconds, unchanged by the weight of the discussion. Holmes rose and moved to the window. He parted the curtains slightly. Outside, Baker Street lay as it always did at this hour, predictable, contained. This city, Holmes said, absorbs much. Watson followed his gaze. It absorbs patterns, Holmes continued, and renders them inconspicuous. He returned to his chair. The man at Burlstone, Holmes said, did not live quietly by accident. Watson felt the implications settle without urgency. He lived, Holmes continued, in anticipation. Watson remained silent. Holmes selected another paper and read a single line. The threat, Holmes said, was not immediate. It was procedural. Watson looked up. There are organizations, Holmes went on, that do not pursue. They wait. The fire diminished slightly. then stabilized. The house, Holmes said, was not a refuge. It was a terminus. Watson understood. Holmes gathered the papers and aligned them precisely. He tapped the stack once against the table, squaring the edges. "We will not act tonight," he said. Watson had expected this. "Observation," Holmes continued, "precedes engagement." He stood and extinguished one lamp, then another, leaving only the fire to provide light. The room softened. Watson rose and prepared to retire. At the bedroom door he paused. "Holmes," he said quietly. "Yes, the valley," Watson said. "It still exists." Holmes inclined his head slightly. "Not as a place," he replied. "As a method." Watson nodded and withdrew. Holmes remained seated. He watched the fire until it reduced itself to embers. Outside, the city continued its routine, unaware of patterns beneath its surface. The case progressed, not forward, but inward. Night settled again over Baker Street, not as an interruption, but as continuation. The street lamps formed their familiar sequence, each glow contained within its own small circle. Footsteps passed occasionally, softened by distance and repetition. Inside 21B, the air had cooled just enough to require the fire's steady attention. Holmes remained awake. He sat at the table, the papers aligned before him with careful precision. The room held no urgency. Each object occupied its accustomed place, contributing to the sense of order that Holmes preferred when thought required no pressure. Watson slept in the adjoining room. Holmes reviewed the documents again, not to extract new information, but to reaffirm what had already settled into certainty. Names repeated, locations shifted, patterns held. He set one paper aside and selected another. The organization described there was not given a title. It did not require one. Its function was implied by the consistency of its structure. Membership was transient. Procedure was permanent. Holmes closed the file and rested his hands flat on the table. The method, reflected, had survived because it demanded little from those who carried it forward. No belief was required, only compliance. He stood and moved quietly across the room. The floorboards responded with a familiar sound, neither loud nor secretive. At the window, he parted the curtains slightly and observed the street below. Nothing drew attention. That, Holmes noted, was the design. He returned to the table and sat again. The valley, as it had been described, existed once as a controlled environment. Fear had been administered in measured doses. Routine ensured obedience. Silence was enforced through repetition rather than punishment. When such an environment dissolved, its participants did not disperse evenly. Some sought anonymity, others sought distance, a few sought structure. The man known as Douglas had chosen all three. Holmes considered the simplicity of that choice. He removed his notebook and wrote a single line. He paused, then added another. The pencil made no unnecessary sound. The clock advanced. Each second followed the last with impartial regularity. Holmes extinguished the fire and replaced it with a smaller, controlled flame. The room dimmed, encouraging rest rather than thought. At some point before morning, Watson stirred. He entered the sitting room quietly, his movements practiced, his presence unobtrusive. He did not ask why Holmes was awake. He did not need to. Holmes acknowledged him with a slight inclination of the head. "The method," Holmes said, without preamble, "is consistent across cases." Watson took a seat. "It survives because it is simple," Holmes continued, "and because it promises order." Watson listened. "In the valley," Holmes said, "order was enforced. In England, it is requested." Watson considered the distinction. "The threat," Holmes went on, "was not violence. It was recognition. Watson nodded slowly. To be seen, Holmes said, by a system designed to forget. Silence returned. Outside, the first suggestion of morning appeared as a thinning of darkness rather than an arrival of light. Holmes stood and stretched, not from fatigue, but from habit. He gathered the papers and returned them to their case. "We will receive a visitor today," he said. Watson looked up. "He will not know," Holmes continued, "that he has come to provide confirmation." Watson accepted this. Holmes checked the clock and nodded once, as though aligning himself with its measurement. "The case," Holmes said, "is no longer at Burlstone." Watson rose and began to prepare breakfast. The kettle warmed. Cups were set out. The routine grounded the room further, anchoring it in the present. As they ate, Holmes spoke only once more. "Systems," he said, "do not end. They adapt." Watson set his cup down. "And when they adapt," Holmes added, "they reveal themselves." The morning continued its slow approach. Baker Street remained unchanged, and somewhere within the city, a method prepared to repeat itself, unaware that it had already been observed. The morning settled into Baker Street with its usual restraint. Light entered the rooms without insistence, spreading evenly across the walls and furniture. The air had been reduced to a low, sustaining warmth. The city outside continued its routine, unaware of observation. Holmes finished his tea and set the cup precisely onto its saucer. The sound it made was brief and complete. Watson folded his newspaper and placed it aside. Neither hurried. At precisely the hour Holmes had anticipated, footsteps approached the door. They paused. There was a single knock, measured and unassertive. Holmes did not rise immediately. "Come in," he said. The door opened. A man entered and removed his hat. His manner was composed, his movements economical. He waited for instruction. Holmes indicated a chair. "Please," he said. The man sat. He held his hat in both hands, resting it on his knees. His gaze moved briefly around the room and then returned to Holmes. Watson observed him quietly. The man spoke first. "I was told," he said, "that you might wish to speak with me." Holmes inclined his head slightly. "You were told correctly," he replied. There was no exchange of pleasantries. None were required. Holmes leaned back in his chair, his expression neutral. "You have been associated," Holmes said, "with certain administrative functions." The man nodded. "Informal ones," he replied. Holmes accepted this distinction without comment. "These functions," Holmes continued, "involved coordination rather than direction." "Yes," the man said. Holmes paused. "And continuity," he added. The man did not answer immediately. He adjusted his grip on the hat, then nodded once. "Yes." Watson noted the movement. Holmes allowed the silence to remain intact. "You were aware," Holmes said, "of a man using the name Douglas." The man hesitated only briefly. "Yes," he said. "You were not in contact with him," Holmes continued. "No." "You were aware of his location?" "Yes." Holmes folded his hands. "And you expected," Holmes said, "that this awareness might eventually be reciprocated?" The man looked down. "Yes," he said quietly. Holmes made no note of this. "You did not act," Holmes continued. "No, because action," Holmes said, "was not required." The man nodded. "The method," Holmes said, "does not require pursuit." "No," the man agreed. Watson felt the weight of the exchange without tension. Holmes stood and moved toward the window. He parted the curtains slightly, then returned to his seat. "You understand," Holmes said. "Annette Sen, what occurred at Burlstone was not an accident." "Yes, and not," Holmes continued, "a spontaneous event." "No." Holmes inclined his head once more. You also understand, he said, that it was not success. The man looked up. In what sense? He asked. In the sense, Holmes replied, that it revealed itself. The man considered this. Yes, he said finally. Holmes allowed the acknowledgement to settle. You have come, Holmes said, to determine what I know. The man did not deny it. And whether, Holmes continued, that knowledge will alter the procedure, the man's expression remained controlled. Yes. Holmes smiled faintly, without warmth. It will, he said. The man waited. Observation, Holmes said, introduces variability. Watson watched the man's hands still. The system, Holmes continued, relies on predictability. The man nodded slowly. You are here, Holmes said, because unpredictability has already occurred. Silence followed. The clock arced the passing seconds. At length, the man rose. I understand, he said. Holmes stood as well. You may go, Holmes said. The man hesitated. Will there be consequences? He asked. Holmes considered the question. There will be adjustments, he replied. The man accepted this and departed. The door closed. Watson remained seated. That, Holmes said, was confirmation. Watson nodded. The method, Holmes continued, has been observed by its own design. Watson understood. Holmes returned to the table and gathered the remaining papers. A case, he said, has reached its quietest phase. Watson looked up. And the most complete, Holmes added. Outside, Baker Street resumed its indistinct movement. Inside, 221B returned to stillness. The valley, now fully revealed as method rather than a place, receded into abstraction, and the room settled, ready to receive the next absence without comment. After the visitor departed, the room adjusted itself. The air seemed to redistribute evenly, as though the space had been holding a minor imbalance that no longer required attention. The door remained closed. The clock continued its impartial measure of time. Outside, Baker Street returned to its ordinary cadence. Holmes remained standing for a moment longer than necessary. He did not move toward the table immediately. Instead, he allowed the silence to complete itself, ensuring that no residue of conversation lingered in the room. Watson waited. At last, Holmes returned to his chair and sat. He placed his hands flat on the table, palms down, not in emphasis, but in conclusion. The pattern, he said, it's complete. Watson inclined his head slightly. It does not require further verification, Holmes continued, only acknowledgement. Watson remained still. Holmes reached for the notebook and reviewed the lines he had written earlier. He did not add to them. The entries were sufficient. In most cases, Holmes said, resolution presents itself as clarity. Watson listened. In this one, Holmes continued, it presents itself as stillness. The fire responded with a minor shift, settling again into a consistent glow. Watson rose and poured fresh tea. The act was unhurried. The cups were placed with care. Holmes accepted his cup without comment. The valley, Holmes said, was once maintained through presence. Watson waited. Men enforced it, Holmes continued. Ritual sustained it. He took a measured sip. When such structures dissolve, Holmes said, their fragments seek environments. What effort is minimized? Watson considered this. England, Holmes went on, provides such an environment. Watson did not respond. The system, Holmes said, requires no violence when recognition alone is sufficient. Watson felt the implications settle gently. To be seen, Holmes continued, by a method designed to remember is often enough. The tea cooled gradually. Holmes set the cup aside. The man at Burlstone, Holmes said, was not pursued. Watson nodded. He was acknowledged, Holmes continued. Watson remained silent. Holmes leaned back and closed his eyes briefly. "There will be no continuation," he said. Watson looked up. "The method," Holmes continued, "has adjusted." The clock marked another minute. "The acknowledgement," Holmes said, "served its purpose." Watson understood. Holmes opened his eyes. "The danger," he said, "was never immediate." Watson waited. "It was procedural," Holmes added. Outside, a carriage passed. The sound diminished quickly, absorbed by distance. "The police," Holmes said, "will record a conclusion." Watson nodded. "They will not record a pattern," Holmes continued. Watson accepted this. Holmes gathered the papers and placed them into their case. He closed it carefully and returned it to the shelf. "The matter," he said, "is concluded." Watson rose and moved toward the window. The street remained unchanged, familiar, contained. "Cases such as this," Holmes said, "do not end with an arrest." Watson turned. "They end," Holmes continued, "with stabilization." The fire lowered itself naturally, requiring no intervention. Holmes stood and adjusted the lamp, reducing the light to its evening setting. Watson prepared to retire. At the door, he paused. "Holmes," he said quietly. "Yes." "The valley," Watson said. "It will not return." Holmes considered the question. "It will persist," he replied, "but not here." Watson nodded and withdrew. Holmes remained seated. The room resumed its full quiet. The pattern had settled, and with it, the case passed from relevance into routine, where it would remain, undisturbed and complete. Evening returned to Baker Street without alteration. The light outside softened and withdrew in stages, leaving the familiar glow of the lamps to define the street. Inside 221B, the room adjusted to night as it always did. Curtains were drawn to the same distance. Chairs remained where they belonged. The clock continued its steady count. Holmes sat near the fire, not to warm himself, but to occupy the space where thought required no movement. Watson read quietly at the table. The turning of pages was unhurried and evenly spaced. The words themselves held no urgency. They existed only to accompany the passage of time. For a long while neither spoke. The case no longer pressed for attention. It had settled into a state that required neither analysis nor defense. It existed now only as understanding. Holmes broke the silence. "There is a difference," he said, "between ending a system and removing its influence." Watson closed his book gently. "Influence," Holmes continued, "lingers longest where it is least visible." Watson nodded. "The valley," Holmes said, "was effective because it reduced complexity." Watson listened. "Choice was removed," Holmes continued. "Routine remained." The fire shifted slightly, then returned to its steady form. "In England," Holmes said, "such systems cannot exist openly." Watson considered this. "They must become subtle," Holmes continued. "They must dissolve into habit." Watson leaned back. "Once pattern is understood," Holmes said, "it no longer exerts the same pressure." Watson accepted this. Holmes stood and crossed the room slowly. He adjusted a book on the shelf that had shifted slightly out of alignment. He returned to his chair. "The acknowledgement," Holmes said, "was sufficient." Watson did not ask what acknowledgement. "It introduced uncertainty," Holmes continued, "and uncertainty weakens repetition." The clock marked another quarter hour. Outside, the city continued without reference to the quiet conclusion unfolding within the room. Watson poured another cup of tea. Holmes declined, with a slight movement of the hand. "There will be no aftermath," Holmes said. Watson looked up. "No pursuit," Holmes continued. "No reaction." Watson nodded. "That is how such systems preserve themselves," Holmes added. by appearing absent. The fire dimmed slightly as fuel settled. Holmes closed his eyes briefly, then opened them again. "The case," he said, "will be recorded as resolved." Watson understood. "But its value," Holmes continued, "is not in resolution." Watson waited. "It was in recognition," Holmes said. Silence returned. Watson rose and prepared to retire for the night. His movements were familiar, practiced, free of tension. At the doorway, he paused. "Holmes," he said. "Yes, there are others," Watson said. "Who came from that valley?" Holmes inclined his head. "Yes," he replied. "And they will continue," Watson said. Holmes considered the statement. "They will adapt," he said. "But adaptation leaves traces." Watson nodded and withdrew. Holmes remained by the fire. The embers glowed softly, offering just enough light to define the room. Shadows stayed in their places. Nothing shifted unexpectedly. The valley, now fully reduced to method and memory, no longer required attention. It had been observed, it had been understood, and in that understanding it had been quietly disarmed. The night completed itself, and Baker Street remained unchanged. The days that followed did not announce themselves as different. Morning arrived at Baker Street with the same gradual certainty. Light found the familiar angles of the room. The city resumed its measured pace. Nothing in the routine suggested that anything had concluded or that anything had begun. Holmes observed this with approval. He sat at the table, reviewing the morning paper without expectation. Headlines passed without consequence. Purports aligned themselves into columns and then dissolved into irrelevance. As his eyes moved on, Watson prepared breakfast. The kettle warmed, cups were set out. The motions were precise, practiced, and entirely unremarkable. The room benefited from this predictability. Holmes folded the paper and set it aside. "There is no reaction," he said. Watson nodded. "That," Holmes continued, "is confirmation." Watson placed the cups down and took his seat. "In systems built on procedure," Holmes said, "reaction indicates instability." Watson listened. "Silence," Holmes continued, "indicates adjustment." The fire responded with a soft shift, then steadied again. Holmes reached for his notebook. He opened it, read the existing entries, and then closed it without adding anything. "There is nothing further to record," he said. Watson accepted this. The hours passed. A client arrived briefly, bringing with him a matter of routine concern. Holmes listened, offered a concise observation, and the matter resolved itself without extension. The client departed satisfied. The room returned to quiet. "This," Holmes said later, "is how influence dissipates." Watson looked up from his reading. "When attention moves elsewhere," Holmes continued, "patterns lose coherence." Watson nodded. Holmes stood and crossed to the window. He looked down at the street, noting the repetition of daily movement. People passed without pause. Each occupied their own interval of time. "No one," Holmes said, "is waiting." Watson understood. Holmes returned to his chair. "The method," he said, "required recognition to function." Watson waited. "Without it," Holmes continued, "it cannot persist in the same form." The clock marked the afternoon. Watson prepared lunch. The plates were cleared. The room remained orderly. At no point did either man refer again to Burlstone. It had been absorbed into context. Late in the day, Holmes adjusted the papers on his desk, aligning them into a smaller, more contained stack. He returned several items to their places on the shelf. "The case," he said, "has reached dormancy." Watson nodded. "Dormancy," Holmes continued, "is preferable to resolution." Watson did not ask why. "It allows for observation," Holmes said, "without interference. The light outside softened. Lamps were lit at the usual hour. The street below changed character without altering its pace. Watson sat near the fire. Holmes selected his violin and tuned it carefully. This time, he played. The notes were low, unassertive, structured enough to be recognizable, but not distinct enough to demand attention. The music filled the room gently, then withdrew between phrases. Watson allowed the sound to occupy the space where thought might otherwise intrude. When Holmes finished, he set the violin aside and returned it to its place. "That," he said, "is sufficient." The evening progressed. Dinner was taken quietly. The routine held. At the close of the day, Watson rose and prepared to retire. At the door he paused. "Holmes," he said. "Yes." "There's no sense," Watson said, "of anything unfinished." Holmes inclined his head. "That," he replied, "is how it should be." Watson withdrew. Holmes remained seated. The room reduced once more to firelight and shadow. The city continued outside, unaffected and unaware. The case existed now only as a completed alignment of facts, no longer requiring presence or thought. The days followed one another, and nothing returned. Ordinary time resumed its shape. It did not arrive abruptly, nor did it require adjustment. It simply continued, as though it had never paused. At Baker Street, mornings followed evenings, and evenings followed mornings, each one resembling the last closely enough to feel familiar, but not so closely as to invite scrutiny. Holmes welcomed this. He found value in the return of unremarkable days. They provided contrast. They allowed the mind to rest in alignment rather than tension. Watson noticed the change, not as absence, but as balance. Breakfasts were taken at the usual hour. The kettle sang softly before settling. Bread was sliced evenly. Cups were warmed before tea was poured. Nothing spilled, nothing rushed. The room seemed to approve. Holmes spent his mornings reading, not for information, but for continuity. He selected volumes he already knew well, allowing his attention to pass over passages. Without resistance, the act was restorative rather than productive. Watson attended to correspondence, replying where necessary, declining where appropriate. The letters that arrived bore no urgency. They asked for clarification, not intervention. Holmes declined several invitations without comment. "There is no advantage," he said, "in movement without necessity." Watson agreed. Outside, the street reflected the same principle. Deliveries arrived. Shops opened and closed. Carriages passed at predictable intervals. The city continued to demonstrate its capacity for self-regulation. In the afternoons, Holmes sometimes walked alone. He chose routes that required no navigation, streets that returned him to where he began without deviation. He observed without collecting detail. When he returned, the room accepted him immediately, as though he had not left. Watson noticed that Holmes no longer kept the papers related to the case on his desk. They had been returned to shelf, integrated among others of similar size and weight. No single document marked itself as significant. "The mind," Holmes said once, "requires closure to release tension." Watson nodded. "But it requires continuity," Holmes added, "to remain stable." The fire was kept low during the day. It existed more as presence than function. At night, it was allowed to strengthen slightly, enough to anchor the room in warmth. Conversation, when it occurred, was brief and sufficient. They spoke of schedules, of weather, of books that required no discussion afterward. There was no need to return to the valley, or the house, or the method that had revealed itself so quietly. The case did not reassert itself. That, Watson observed, was its final indication of completion. One evening, as the light receded and the lamps were lit, Holmes adjusted his chair slightly closer to the fire. He sat without speaking for a long while. Watson read. At last, Holmes spoke. "There is a tendency," he said, "to expect consequences." Watson looked up. "Not all conclusions," Holmes continued, "announce themselves through change." Watson considered this. "Some," Holmes said, "are defined by what does not occur." The clock marked another hour. Watson returned to his book. Later still, Holmes selected his violin and played again. The melody was slower this time, less structured, allowing notes to fade naturally rather than resolve. It filled the room briefly, then withdrew without echo. When he finished, he did not comment. The instrument was returned to its place. The evening concluded. Watson retired. Holmes remained awake for a time longer, not because thought required it, but because the room held its shape best when allowed to settle gradually. Outside, the city dimmed. Inside, the fire reduced itself to embers. The valley did not return. The house did not reappear. The method did not adapt again. Ordinary time continued, uninterrupted and complete. Nothing called attention to itself. That, Watson observed, was the defining feature of the days that followed. The absence of interruption had become so complete that it no longer registered as absence at all. It had become the background against which everything else occurred. Holmes appeared satisfied. He rose each morning at the same hour. He dressed without haste. His movements were economical, not from urgency, but from alignment. The routine required no correction. Watson adjusted easily to the rhythm. The quiet no longer felt provisional. It felt established. Letters arrived and were answered. Some were filed. Others were returned unread. The decisions required no deliberation. Holmes spent long periods seated near the window, observing the street below. Without tracking any individual movement, he watched flow rather than detail. "There is a stability," he said once, "that emerges when systems release their grip." Watson listened. "It is not dramatic," Holmes continued. "It is cumulative." The fire was lighted and extinguished according to the weather rather than the clock. It served function rather than atmosphere. In the afternoons, Holmes sometimes walked with Watson. Their route varied only slightly, enough to maintain familiarity. They spoke little. The city absorbed them without notice. Shops closed and reopened. The same vendors occupied the same corners. No one paused to observe them. That anonymity, Holmes noted, was one of London's most effective qualities. One evening, as they returned, Watson remarked on the lack of inquiry. "No one has asked," he said, "about the case." Holmes nodded. "That," he replied, "is the final confirmation." Watson accepted this. "Influence," Holmes continued, "is measurable by resistance." Watson waited. "When there is none," Holmes said, "it has dissipated." The days continued. At no point did Holmes review the documents again. They remained undisturbed on the shelf, their relevance complete. Watson noticed that Holmes no longer kept his notebook nearby. It had been returned to its drawer. Memory, Holmes once remarked, was most reliable when it was not rehearsed. Evenings were unremarkable. Dinner was taken at the usual hour. Conversation, when it occurred, remained practical. There were no reflective pauses, no revisiting of events. The fire warmed the room just enough to prevent chill. Late one night, Watson found Holmes seated in near darkness, the lamp turned low, the room reduced to shadow and outline. "You are awake," Watson said. "Yes," Holmes replied. "Thinking?" Watson asked. "No," Holmes said. "Listening." Watson waited. "To the absence," Holmes added. Watson nodded. They sat together for a time without speaking. Outside, the city's sounds diminished as night deepened. Inside, the room retained its shape, held together by habit and quiet. Eventually, Holmes stood and extinguished the lamp. "That," he said, "is sufficient." Watson retired. Holmes remained for a few moments longer, ensuring the room had fully settled. Before withdrawing himself, the night completed its course. Nothing intruded, nothing required attention. And in that sustained absence, the case faded entirely from necessity into memory, where it would remain undisturbed. The quiet proved itself over time. It did not rely on contrast. It did not require interruption to be recognized. It simply remained, steady and unchallenged, becoming indistinguishable from the ordinary movement of days. Holmes recognized this as completion. Morning light entered the sitting room at the same angle each day, touching the edge of the table before moving on. Dust settled where it always had. Nothing shifted enough to suggest reconsideration. Watson prepared breakfast as usual. The kettle warmed. Cups were placed. The routine carried no residue from the past. Holmes read briefly, then set the paper aside. "There is no echo," he said. Watson nodded. "Echo," Holmes continued, "is how unresolved systems announce themselves." Watson listened. "When nothing returns," Holmes said, "nothing remains active." The fire was not lit that morning. The room retained enough warmth without it. The absence of flame altered nothing. Holmes spent the morning organizing the shelf where older case files were kept. He did not review them. He adjusted their alignment, restoring symmetry rather than content. "These," he said, gesturing to the shelf, "are concluded." Watson accepted the statement. Outside, the street showed no variation. Deliveries arrived at the same hour. Voices passed without lingering. The city maintained its equilibrium. In the afternoon, a light rain began. It fell evenly, without wind. The sound against the windows was consistent, soft and predictable. Holmes sat near the window, listening. "Rain," he said, "reveals imbalance." Watson looked up. "It did not," Holmes added. The rain passed. Evening came. Lamps were lit. The room adjusted. Dinner was taken quietly. Watson noticed that Holmes no longer kept watch at night. He retired earlier, not from fatigue, but from confidence. A case no longer occupied any interval of attention. Late that evening, Watson found Holmes standing by the shelf once more. "You are certain?" Watson said. "Yes," Holmes replied. "There is nothing further," Watson said. Holmes nodded. "The structure," he said, "has collapsed inward." Watson considered this. "It no longer projects," Holmes continued. "It no longer seeks alignment." The clock marked another hour. Watson prepared to retire. At the door he paused. "Holmes," he said. "Yes." "If such a method were to form again," Watson said, "would we know?" Holmes considered the question carefully. "Yes," he said, "because it would require attention." Watson nodded and withdrew. Holmes extinguished the remaining lamp and sat in the dark for a moment longer, allowing the room to complete its cycle. The quiet did not shift. The night progressed. And in that sustained stillness, the certainty of conclusion remained intact, requiring no reinforcement, no reminder, and no return. What settled did so without return. It was not marked by an ending, nor by any signal that might distinguish it from the ordinary passage of time. Instead, it became indistinguishable from routine, folded gently into the days, as though it had always belonged there. Holmes noticed this first, in the smallest details. The chair by the window no longer required adjustment. The lamp remained at its preferred height, without being corrected. The stack of letters on the table never grew beyond what could be addressed in one sitting. Nothing accumulated. Watson observed the same phenomenon in the rhythm of conversation. There were no unfinished sentences, no thoughts left suspended. Each exchange reached its natural conclusion and rested there. Morning followed night, without emphasis. Holmes rose, dressed, and took his place at the table. Watson prepared breakfast. The sounds were familiar, predictable, and contained. The city outside continued to move, but without urgency. Its pace neither accelerated nor slowed. It maintained equilibrium. When something no longer asserts itself, Holmes continued, it has completed its function. The fire was lit only briefly that day. It was extinguished as soon as it had served its purpose. The room retained the warmth, without protest. Holmes spent the late mornings sorting through a small drawer of odds and ends. He did not examine the contents closely. He arranged them by size and returned the drawer to its place. "This," he said, "is how excess is removed." Watson watched. "Not by elimination," Holmes added, "but by integration." The afternoon passed without interruption. No visitor arrived. No message required attention. The door remained closed, except when Watson stepped out briefly and returned. Evening approached gradually. As the light shifted, Holmes adjusted the curtains to their customary position. He did so without thought, guided by repetition rather than choice. Watson read quietly. The fire was allowed to burn low, producing more presence than heat. Its glow softened the edges of the room without altering its shape. Later, Holmes spoke again. "The method we observed," he said, "required renewal." Watson listened. "Without renewal," Holmes continued, "it cannot persist." Watson understood. "It has not renewed," Holmes added. The clock marked another interval. Watson closed his book. Outside, a light breeze moved through the street, barely noticeable, more suggestion than force. Holmes stood and stretched lightly, not from fatigue, but from completion. He looked around the room, not to assess, but to acknowledge. Everything remained as it should. Watson rose and prepared to retire. At the doorway he paused. "Holmes," he said. "Yes, there is no sense," Watson said, "of waiting." Holmes inclined his head. "That," he replied, "is the final sign." Watson nodded and withdrew. Holmes remained seated, the room illuminated only by the softened firelight. He did not think of the valley, nor the house, nor the structure that had once required attention. They had receded fully. The night continued without interruption. And what had settled did not return, not because it was suppressed, but because it had completed its purpose and released itself into ordinary time. The calm lengthened without effort. It did not deepen, nor did it fade. It simply extended, occupying time with such consistency that it became difficult to imagine it ever having been otherwise. At Baker Street, the days assembled themselves into a continuous line, each one resting gently against the next. Holmes observed this with quiet approval. He no longer measured time by cases, but by intervals of routine. Morning light, midday quiet, evening shadow, night rest. Each arrived as expected, and none overstayed. Watson noticed that Holmes had stopped arranging objects entirely. The room maintained its own order now, no longer requiring supervision. Books remained aligned. Papers did not drift. Even the chairs seemed to return naturally to their places after use. Breakfast passed without comment. The kettle warmed. Cups were filled. The small sounds of porcelain and water completed themselves, and then ceased. Outside, the street reflected the same stability. The same faces appeared at similar hours. The same footsteps echoed briefly, and then moved on. Nothing lingered long enough to suggest disruption. Holmes spent part of the morning seated near the fire, though it was not lit. The hearth existed now as a structural feature rather than a source of heat. Its presence was enough. "There is a point," Holmes said quietly, "where observation must end." Watson listened. "Not because understanding is incomplete," Holmes continued, "but because it is sufficient." Watson nodded. The afternoon brought light rain. It fell evenly, touching the windows without force. The sound was gentle and repetitive, neither distracting nor demanding. Holmes listened for a few moments, then returned to his reading. Watson wrote letters. Each was finished in one sitting. None required revision. The rain stopped. The street dried. The city resumed its shape. In the early evening, Holmes stood and walked the length of the room once. Slowly, as though confirming the distance had not changed, he returned to his chair without comment. Dinner followed the usual pattern. Conversation was minimal, not from reserve, but from completion. There was nothing left to clarify. He played only a few notes, spaced widely apart. Each note existed alone, allowed to fade fully before the next appeared. When he finished, he returned the instrument to its place. "That," he said, "is enough." Watson smiled faintly and returned to his book. The clock advanced. The lamps were lowered. The fire remained unlit. At the close of the evening, Watson prepared to retire. He paused at the door. "Holmes," he said. "Yes, this calm," Watson said. "It feels permanent." Holmes considered the word. "It is durable," he replied, "not permanent." Watson nodded. "But durable is sufficient," Holmes added. Watson withdrew. Holmes remained seated in the dim light, the outlines of the room softened by shadow. He did not reflect on past events. He did not anticipate future ones. The calm did not require vigilance. It extended naturally into the night, and the long stillness held, uninterrupted, complete in its quiet continuity. The night held without pressure. It did not deepen abruptly, nor did it thin unexpectedly. It settled across the city in measured layers, each one resting comfortably atop the last. Baker Street accepted it as it always had, with no adjustment required. Inside 221B, the rooms responded by growing quieter. Holmes sat in his chair, not to think, but to remain present as the evening completed itself. The lamp beside him was turned low, its light contained and steady. Shadows rested where they fell, unchanged by movement. Watson slept. The clock advanced with its familiar rhythm, marking time without emphasis. Each second followed the previous one with perfect consistency, requiring no attention to be understood. Holmes closed his eyes briefly, then opened them again. The room appeared unchanged. This, he noted, was as it should be. There was a particular quality to nights like this one. They did not invite reflection. They discouraged it. Instead, they offered containment, allowing the mind to rest within the boundaries of the present. Holmes remained seated, hands resting loosely, posture unstrained. Outside, a distant carriage passed. The sound reached the window already softened, already receding. It did not linger long enough to register as interruption. The fire had been extinguished earlier. The room retained its warmth without protest. The absence of flame altered nothing. Holmes rose and crossed the room slowly, his steps measured and deliberate. He adjusted the curtain by a fraction, allowing less light from the street to enter. The change was minimal, but sufficient. He returned to his chair. There were nights, he reflected, when stillness functioned as confirmation, not of an outcome, but of balance. When nothing pressed forward, it meant nothing had been left unresolved. He allowed this thought to pass without elaboration. The shelf of case files remained untouched. Their presence was structural now, not active. They existed as reference, not reminder. Holmes listened to the room itself, the faint settling of wood, the near imperceptible movement of air. These were not signals, they were constants. The night continued. At some point, Watson stirred briefly in his sleep, a shift of position, a return to rest. The sound was absorbed immediately by the quiet. Holmes did not move. There was no need to guard the silence. It sustained itself. The clock marked another hour. Holmes leaned back slightly and allowed his gaze to soften, no longer directed at any object in particular. The outlines of the room blurred gently, becoming suggestion rather than definition. This, he knew, was the state in which nothing further could occur, not because it was prevented, but because it was unnecessary. The night held its shape. Time passed without accumulation, and in that steady holding, the long arc of the case, from its first quiet indication to its complete release, dissolved fully into the background of ordinary existence. Nothing waited. Nothing followed. The night continued, complete in its restraint, carrying the room forward without disturbance, without return, and without demand. Morning arrived without request. It entered Baker Street as it always did, through gradual light and subtle change rather than declaration. The night withdrew cleanly, leaving no trace of itself beyond the soft memory of rest. Inside 21B, the rooms adjusted without effort. Holmes was already awake. He did not rise immediately. He remained seated for a few moments longer, allowing the transition to complete itself. The quality of the air had shifted slightly. The sounds outside had rearranged themselves. This was enough. He stood and opened the curtain a measured distance. The street below appeared intact, familiar, predictable. Nothing had accumulated overnight. Watson emerged shortly after, moving quietly, his routine unchanged. He prepared the kettle and set out the cups. The sequence required no discussion. They ate in silence. The quiet was not tentative. It was established. Holmes folded the morning paper without reading it fully and placed it aside. There was nothing within it that required interpretation. The absence, he said at last, has held. Watson nodded. That, Holmes continued, confirms duration. Watson accepted this without question. The morning progressed in small, contained intervals. Letters were sorted. Short reply was written and sealed. The book was returned to its place on the shelf after only a few pages. Nothing lingered. Outside, the city advanced through its patterns. The deliveries arrived. Conversations passed without anchoring. The street absorbed all movement and released it again unchanged. Holmes spent part of the morning standing near the window, hands resting lightly at his sides. He observed the flow of people without selecting any individual for attention. "There is no pressure," he said quietly. Watson listened. "When a system dissolves completely," Holmes continued, "it leaves no vacuum." Watson nodded. The fire remained unlit. The room required no adjustment. In the afternoon, Holmes and Watson walked briefly, choosing a route that curved back upon itself. It spoke only once, to acknowledge the weather. The walk completed its purpose without deviation. When they returned, the room received them immediately, as though no interval had passed. Holmes removed his coat and placed it in its usual position. It settled naturally. Watson prepared tea. The afternoon light shifted and then softened, its passage marked only by the movement of shadow along the wall. Holmes sat and closed his eyes briefly, not to think, but to confirm the absence of disturbance. He opened them again and found nothing had changed. "This," he said, "is the state that follows conclusion." Watson did not respond. None was required. Evening approached. The lamps were lighted at the customary hour. The room adjusted. Dinner followed without remark. At no point did the valley, the house, or the method return to thought. They had been released fully. Later, as Watson prepared to retire, he paused. "Holmes," he said. "Yes, there is no sense," Watson said, "of vigilance." Holmes considered the word. "That is correct," he replied. "Vigilance belongs to anticipation." Watson nodded and withdrew. Holmes remained seated for a time longer, allowing the day to complete itself without interruption. The room grew dimmer. The city softened. Night approached again, measured and unremarkable. The morning had asked nothing, and in answering nothing, it confirmed that nothing further was required. The quiet that remained was not empty. It was full in a different way, full of continuity, full of repetition, full of the kind of stability that requires no defense. At Baker Street, the rooms held their shape with no effort at all. Objects rested where they had always rested. Light moved through the space without resistance. Time no longer felt segmented. It moved as a single unbroken flow. Holmes recognized this immediately, not as a change, but as an absence of change, the clearest indicator of resolution. Morning light entered the sitting room and spread across the floor in a wide, pale band. It reached the leg of the table, touched the edge of the chair, and stopped. It did not advance further, as though the room itself had decided where it should rest. Watson was already awake. The kettle warmed quietly. Cups were arranged with familiar precision. The small sounds of preparation completed themselves, and then dissolved into stillness. Holmes entered the room and took his seat without speaking. They ate in silence, not the silence of restraint, the silence of completion. The city outside moved in its habitual rhythm. Footsteps, distant voices, the faint movement of carts and carriages, all of it blended into a single, soft background presence that never demanded attention. Holmes opened morning paper, read a few lines, and folded it again. "There is nothing forming," he said quietly. Watson nodded. "When systems dissolve," Holmes continued, "they sometimes attempt reassembly." Watson listened. "This one has not," Holmes said. The fire remained unlit. The room required no warmth beyond what already existed. The morning passed without event. Holmes spent time near the window, not observing individuals, but the movement itself, the collective flow of the street as a single organism. No patterns distinguished themselves. No repetitions stood out. Everything blended. Watson wrote letters. Each was finished in one sitting. None required revision. None required urgency. The hours moved forward with no markers. At midday, they ate lightly. No conversation followed. The room absorbed their presence and returned it without change. In the afternoon, Holmes walked alone, not with purpose, with alignment. He chose streets that curved naturally, leading him back without decision. His steps maintained an even rhythm. His gaze remained wide rather than focused. The city offered nothing unusual, no disruptions, no signals, no repetition that suggested structure. When he returned, the room received him immediately. Watson had prepared tea. The cups were warm. The kettle had been returned to its place. Nothing required correction. Holmes sat and closed his eyes for a moment, listening to the room, the faint creak of settling wood, the distant sound of movement in the street, the nearly imperceptible shift of air, all constants, all stable. "This," he said quietly, "is equilibrium." Watson looked up. "Not absence," Holmes continued. "Balance." Watson nodded. The afternoon light shifted gradually, its path along the wall slow and continuous. No sharp changes, no contrasts. Evening approached without signal. The lamps were lit. Dinner followed the usual routine. Conversation was unnecessary. The fire was lit low, more presence than heat. Later, Holmes selected his violin. He did not tune it for performance, only for alignment. He played slowly, allowing wide spaces between notes. Each sound existed briefly, then faded completely before the next merged. There was no melody to follow, only rhythm, only spacing, only repetition. Watson listened without tracking. When Holmes finished, he returned the instrument to its place without comment. The room settled again. Later still, Holmes spoke. "The valley," he said, "no longer exists in any functional sense." Watson listened. "It persists only as memory," Holmes continued. "And memory does not organize itself." Watson nodded. "The method," Holmes said, "has no structure to inhabit." Watson accepted this. "The house," Holmes added, "was a terminus." Silence followed. The clock advanced. Outside, the street quieted. As night deepened, Holmes rose and crossed the room slowly. He adjusted the curtains slightly, reducing the light by a fraction. He returned to his chair. "This," he said, "is the final state." Watson looked up. "When nothing remains to adapt," Holmes continued, "nothing remains active." Watson understood. The fire reduced itself to embers. The room dimmed. Watson prepared to retire. At the doorway, he paused. "Holmes," he said. "Yes, this quiet," Watson said, "feels complete." Holmes considered the word. "Yes," he replied, "it is." Watson withdrew. Holmes remained seated for a time longer, allowing the room to complete its transition into night. The outlines softened, the shadows deepened, nothing shifted unexpectedly. The city continued beyond the window, distant and unintrusive. The quiet held, not as silence, not as absence, but as presence without pressure. And in that presence, the long movement of the case, from its first subtle emergence to its final dissolution, released fully into the background of ordinary life, where it would remain, undisturbed, unremembered, and complete. The room let go without effort. It did not mark the moment. It did not signal completion. It simply reached a point where holding was no longer required. At Baker Street, the final night arrived as every other night had arrived before it, quietly, predictably, and without expectation. Holmes sat alone in the sitting room. The fire had burned down to a steady line of embers, providing just enough light to outline the familiar shapes of the room. The chair opposite him remained empty, its presence unchanged. The table held no papers. The shelf showed no disturbance. Everything that belonged had returned to where it naturally rested. Watson slept. The city outside continued its distant movement. A carriage passed somewhere beyond the reach of detail. Footsteps echoed briefly, and then disappeared. Even these sounds felt incidental, as though they belonged to another rhythm entirely. Holmes did not reflect. Reflection implies a return. There was nothing to return to. Instead, he allowed the room to exist as it was, complete, unburdened, and settled into its own continuity. The air carried no tension. The walls held no residue. The space required nothing further from him. He rose and crossed the room slowly, not to inspect, but to acknowledge. His hand rested briefly on the back of the chair near the window. The fabric remained smooth, unchanged by time or use. The curtain hung exactly where it had been left. Holmes adjusted it by the smallest measure, then returned it to its previous position, as though confirming that even alteration was unnecessary. He returned to his chair. There was a quality to this final quiet that differed subtly from the calm before it, not deeper, not broader, simply complete. Completion does not announce itself. It settles. The clock continued its steady rhythm. Seconds passed without accumulating meaning. Minutes followed without structure. Time behaved as it always did when no attention was paid to it. Holmes closed his eyes briefly, not to rest, to release. The case, if it could still be called that, had long since passed beyond relevance. It no longer existed as sequence, cause, or consequence. It existed only as a completed alignment that no longer required containment. The valley had dissolved, not erased, dissolved. The house half fulfilled its purpose and returned to anonymity. The method had been seen, and in being seen, had lost coherence. Nothing followed, nothing replaced it. This was not victory, it was equilibrium. Holmes opened his eyes again. The room appeared unchanged. That was confirmation enough. At some point before dawn, Watson stirred. He entered the sitting room quietly, as he had done so many times before. He paused at the threshold, observing the reduced firelight, the familiar outline of Holmes in his chair. "You are still awake," Watson said softly. "Yes," Holmes replied. Watson did not ask why. He took a seat opposite, then allowed the quiet to settle between them. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Watson said, "It feels finished." Holmes inclined his head slightly. "It is," he said. "Completely?" Watson asked. Holmes considered the question carefully. "Yes," he replied, "completely enough." Watson accepted this. They sat together as the last of the night completed itself. The sky outside lightened imperceptibly. The darkness withdrew without resistance. Morning approached. Holmes stood and extinguished the remaining embers. The hearth cooled gradually, retaining warmth without flame. The room adjusted to the absence easily. Watson rose as well. They prepared breakfast without discussion. The kettle warmed. Cups were placed. The routine returned as it always did, not as repetition, but as structure. Light entered the room and rested where it always rested. The street resumed its daily rhythm. Nothing had shifted. Nothing needed to. They ate in silence, not because there was nothing to say, but because nothing required saying. After breakfast, Holmes returned the final items to their places. A book was aligned. A chair was adjusted by habit rather than need. The room returned to its complete symmetry. Holmes stood at the window one last time. The city stretched before him, unchanged and indifferent. People moved within their own intervals of time. No one paused. No one waited. Leur platform. Holmes turned away. "That," he said quietly, "is enough." Watson nodded. The day unfolded. The room held. And with no further acknowledgement, the story ended, not as a conclusion, but as a release into ordinary time, where nothing pressed forward, nothing lingered behind, and everything continued exactly as it should. The valley no longer cast a shadow. The fear no longer required form, and 21 Baker Street returned fully, finally, to itself.